Growing up, I always felt like a background character in my own family story. My older brother, Ethan, was the star of the show, the golden child. He excelled at everything: sports, academics, charming everyone at family gatherings. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the bookworm who preferred the company of fantasy novels and video games to the spotlight Ethan thrived in. My parents adored Ethan's every achievement, celebrating his soccer trophies and academic scholarships as if they were family victories. Me, I was just the other one. Our parents, Susan and Greg, are traditional in every sense of the word. Dad is a retired high school principal, stoic and principled, with a strong belief in earning your way through life. Mom, on the other hand, was the quintessential homemaker, always bustling around the house, keeping everything perfect, and ensuring Ethan's accomplishments were framed and prominently displayed. My own achievements, few as they were in their eyes, rarely made it past a polite acknowledgement. Then there was my younger sister, Chloe. She was the family's princess, adored and doted on, though not quite at Ethan's level. Chloe had a natural talent for making people laugh and lighting up a room. It wasn't hard to see why she was a favourite, even though her attention-seeking antics sometimes annoyed me. Still, she had an innocence about her that made it impossible to truly resent her. For years, I tried to live up to their expectations, but it was a losing battle. Ethan's shadow was too large, and my asthma, introversion, and average grades didn't help. By the time I hit my early 20s, I had stopped trying to impress them altogether. Instead, I threw myself into building a life outside of their orbit. I worked at a local comic book and video game store, which felt like a perfect fit. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My passion for technology grew, and I started dabbling in IT work on the side. Eventually, I co-founded a small tech support business with a friend, Mark. We poured our hearts into it, and years later, it paid off. When we sold the company to a larger corporation, I walked away with stock options and a decent payout. My hard work had finally paid off, yet my family never knew about any of it. To them, I was still the aimless kid working retail. They never asked about my life, and honestly, I didn't volunteer much. It felt easier that way. My successes weren't framed in the family living room, and I had made peace with that. Or so I thought. The catalyst for the drama came in the form of a Sunday dinner, a family tradition I still attended out of obligation. These dinners were predictable affairs, a weekly stage for Ethan's latest accomplishments, and Mum's gushing about how proud she was of him. Chloe would chime in with stories about her kids, and Dad would share updates about his golf game. I'd sit quietly, smiling politely, occasionally contributing when asked about my job, which they still thought was at the long-defunct comic book store. On this particular evening, Ethan was unusually smug, even for him. He leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of wine, and started dropping subtle digs about how I should really think about settling down. He loved to paint himself as the wise older brother, doling out life advice as if his sprawling suburban mansion and luxury SUV made him an authority on everything. "You know, Jake," Ethan said, his tone dripping with condescension, "it's never too late to turn things around. If you ever need help getting on your feet, just say the word. I've got connections." I bit my tongue, as I often did. Engaging only fueled him. Mom, of course, jumped in to praise Ethan for his generosity, and Dad nodded approvingly. Chloe, to her credit, gave me a sympathetic smile, but it wasn't enough to counter the familiar wave of frustration bubbling up inside me. Then Ethan dropped the bombshell. "Actually," he said, setting his glass down with a theatrical flourish, "I did a little digging recently, hired someone to look into a few things." My stomach dropped. The table fell silent, all eyes on Ethan as he leaned forward, clearly relishing the suspense. "What are you talking about?" I asked, keeping my tone even despite the unease creeping in. "Oh, nothing major," Ethan replied casually. "Just wanted to make sure everything's okay with you. You know, financially and all. It's what a good brother does." I felt the blood drain from my face. He had hired a private investigator to dig into my life, without my knowledge, without my consent. The audacity of it left me speechless. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Ethan, what did you find?" Ethan smirked, clearly expecting some grand revelation to confirm his low opinion of me. "Let's just say it's interesting." But as he began to recount his findings, his smug expression faltered. The PI hadn't uncovered a struggling retail worker barely scraping by. Instead, they'd found out about my tech company, the sale, my stock options, and my current role as a CTO at a successful startup. They discovered my assets, my modest but well-maintained home, my investments, my carefully cultivated career. Ethan's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. He stammered, clearly blindsided by the truth. My parents looked at me, wide-eyed, as if seeing me for the first time. Chloe's jaw dropped. I didn't know," Ethan finally muttered, his bravado gone. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment sink in. For once, I wasn't the one squirming at the dinner table. "You should have asked," I said calmly. "But I guess you didn't think I was worth that much effort." The table remained silent, the weight of the revelation hanging heavily in the air. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not for who they thought I was, but for who I truly am. But with that recognition came a new storm I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The silence at the dinner table after Ethan's revelation felt suffocating. My parents exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and unease. Chloe fidgeted in her seat, clearly unsure of how to break the tension. Meanwhile, Ethan, still reeling from the private investigator's findings, looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. "Jake," Mom finally said, her voice wavering. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain. Years of being overlooked and dismissed couldn't be summed up in a soundbite. "It didn't seem like anyone was interested," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "That's not fair," Dad interjected, his voice carrying that authoritative edge I knew so well. "We've always cared about you. We just didn't know how to reach you. It wasn't the time or place to unpack the years of neglect, so I simply nodded." But Ethan, apparently unable to let his bruised ego sit quietly, piped up. "Maybe you didn't tell us because you knew you were hiding something," he said, his words dripping with accusation. "Living this secret life while the rest of us have been here, trying to include you in the family." I clenched my fists under the table, keeping my voice steady. "I wasn't hiding anything, Ethan. I just didn't see the point in sharing when it always felt like it wouldn't matter." "Oh, it matters now," he shot back, his tone venomous. "Especially with how you're sitting on all that money while Mum and Dad have to watch every penny." My heart sank. Here it was, the shift from surprise to expectation. I had seen this coming the moment Ethan revealed he'd dug into my life. My success wasn't a point of pride for them. It was a resource they could tap. "Ethan!" Chloe snapped, surprising me. "That's not fair. Jake's worked hard for what he has. He doesn't owe anyone an explanation or a handout." Ethan glared at her, but before he could respond, Mum spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "Chloe's right. We're proud of you, Jake. It's just, we're surprised, that's all. And you know, the family could always use some help." There it was, the pivot. My stomach churned as I forced myself to stay calm. "What do you mean by help?" Mum glanced at Dad, who nodded slightly, giving her permission to continue. "Well, you know how tight things have been lately. Your dad's pension doesn't stretch as far as it used to, and the house needs a new roof. Ethan's boys are growing up so fast, and sports are expensive. And don't forget about Chloe's kids," Ethan added, cutting her off. "Private school isn't cheap, you know." I stared at them in disbelief. "You're asking me to bankroll the entire family." "Not bankroll," Mum said quickly, as though softening the word would make the request more palatable. "Just contribute. You've done so well for yourself, Jake. It's only fair that you share your success." The weight of their expectations crashed down on me like a tidal wave. For years, I had been the overlooked one, the disappointment. Now, suddenly, I was the golden goose. And the hypocrisy of it all, the way they had dismissed me, only to come crawling now that I had something they wanted, stung more than I could put into words. The following weekend, Mum called to announce a family meeting. The formality of it was unusual, and I knew it wasn't just to check in. Sure enough, when I arrived at their house, the atmosphere was tense. Mum had made her famous casserole, and Dad was already nursing a beer. Ethan and Chloe were there too, both looking uncomfortable. As soon as we sat down, Mum launched into her pitch. She framed it as a family discussion about how we could all support each other better. But it quickly became clear that the focus was on how I could support them. "We're not asking for much," she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Just a little help here and there. Maybe cover the roof repairs, or help Ethan with the boys' equipment costs." Chloe shifted in her seat, clearly uneasy. "Mom, I don't think it's fair to put all this on Jake. He's got his own life." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Oh, please. He's sitting on millions. A few thousand here and there wouldn't even make a dent." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "Ethan, this isn't about the money. It's about the principle. For years, I was the family failure. Now that I've done something with my life, suddenly I'm supposed to bail everyone out." Dad finally spoke up, his tone gruff. "Don't make this about the past, Jake. We're talking about now. You've done well, and that's great. But family takes care of family." I couldn't hold back anymore. "Does family take care of family?" Because for years, I was mocked, belittled, and ignored. Where was that family loyalty then? The room fell silent. Mum's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But I quickly pushed it aside. I had spent too long swallowing my feelings for their sake. "I've worked hard to get where I am," I continued, my voice steady. "And I'm not going to let guilt or obligation drag me down. I'll help where I can, but I'm not a blank check for everyone's problems." Ethan scoffed, muttering something under his breath about selfishness. I ignored him. Chloe gave me a small nod of support, but I could tell she was torn between siding with me and keeping the peace. That night, I lay awake in my small apartment, replaying the conversation in my head. Part of me felt vindicated for standing up for myself, But another part felt the familiar sting of being the outcast. Why was it so hard for them to see me as more than a resource? Why couldn't they acknowledge my worth without attaching a price tag to it? My thoughts spiraled as I thought back to all the times I had tried to prove myself to them. The countless family dinners where I sat quietly while Ethan basked in their praise. The years I spent building my life from the ground up, with no support or encouragement from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I knew I couldn't change the past, but I could control how I moved forward. It was time to set boundaries. Not just for my own sanity, but to ensure that my hard-earned success wasn't swallowed by their endless demands. Over the next few weeks, I made my stance clear. When Ethan called to ask for help with his boys' new gear, I told him no. When Mum hinted about the roof repairs, I suggested they look into a home equity loan. Each refusal felt like a small victory, though it didn't come without backlash. "You're tearing this family apart," Ethan snapped during one heated phone call. "All we're asking for is a little help, and you can't even do that. What's the point of all your success if you're just going to hoard it?" "It's not hoarding," I replied calmly. "It's setting boundaries, something this family clearly doesn't understand." The tension only grew, but so did my resolve. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bending to their expectations, and while it was painful, it was also liberating. It happened during one of Mum's infamous Sunday dinners. I'd managed to avoid a few over the past month, citing work commitments, but I couldn't dodge them forever. Mum's guilt-laden calls eventually wore me down, and there I was, seated across from Ethan at the crowded dining table, trying to navigate the minefield of family conversation. Everything seemed normal at first. Normal for us anyway. Dad grumbled about the local news. Mum kept trying to steer the conversation to Ethan's boys' upcoming basketball tournament, and Chloe quietly sipped her wine, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Then, Ethan dropped the bombshell. "Well, since Jake decided not to help with the roof or the boys' sports fees, I took matters into my own hands," he announced, leaning back in his chair like he'd just scored a major victory. "Mum and Dad, I set up a joint account for us. I figured Jake could just deposit money there so it's easier to distribute for the family." The room went silent. My fork clattered onto my plate, the sound echoing in the heavy stillness. "What?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. Ethan smirked. "It's not a big deal. I was just being proactive. You're the one who said you wanted to help in your own way, right? Now you can just transfer funds whenever. No need for all this back and forth." My heart raced, anger bubbling to the surface. "You took it upon yourself to open an account with my name on it, without asking me. Technically, it's not in your name," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's in Mum and Dad's, but it's for the family, Jake. You've got more than enough to spare." The audacity of it left me stunned. After months of refusing to see me as anything but a walking ATM, Ethan had taken things to a whole new level. And my parents, they just sat there, avoiding my gaze. "You were okay with this?" I asked, looking directly at Mum and Dad. "Well," Mum began, her tone hesitant, "we thought it might make things simpler. You've always said you wanted to support the family." I slammed my hands on the table, startling everyone. "I never said that. I've made it clear that I'm not here to bankroll your lives. And you," I said, pointing at Ethan, "have no right to meddle in my finances. This is crossing a line." Ethan leaned forward, his smirk gone. "Oh, stop playing the victim, Jake. You're sitting on millions while the rest of us are struggling. You're selfish, plain and simple." "You think I don't know how to struggle?" I shot back, my voice shaking with fury. "You think it was easy to get where I am? I clawed my way up while you sat here playing the golden boy. I've been mocked, dismissed, and ignored by all of you. And now, the second you see dollar signs, you think you can just take what you want?" Chloe finally spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Ethan, this isn't right. Jake has every right to set boundaries. You're treating him like a bank, not a brother." "Oh, don't act like you're above it," Ethan sneered. "You're just waiting for your turn to ask for something." "That's enough," I snapped, standing up. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I'm done. Done with the dinners, the guilt trips, the constant expectation that I owe you something. I've tried to be patient, to explain myself, but clearly none of you respect me enough to listen." "Jake, please," Mum said, tears welling up in her eyes. "Don't do this. We're family. Family doesn't treat each other like this," I replied, my voice hard. "Family doesn't exploit or manipulate. Family doesn't dig into your private life and then use it against you." I turned to leave, but Ethan's voice stopped me. "Go ahead," he spat. "Walk out. It's what you've always been good at. Running away." I turned back, my chest tight with anger and hurt. "No, Ethan. I'm not running away. I'm setting myself free." With that, I walked out of the house, ignoring the stunned silence behind me. My heart pounded as I got into my car and drove off, the weight of years of resentment lifting with every mile I put between myself and that house. That night, I filed a fraud alert on my accounts and contacted a lawyer to ensure Ethan's meddling wouldn't cause further problems. It was a decisive move, one that signified I was taking back control of my life. For too long, I had let their opinions and expectations dictate my actions. Not anymore. As I sat alone in my apartment, the anger gave way to sadness. Cutting ties wasn't easy. It felt like losing a part of myself. But I knew it was necessary. For the first time in years, I put my own needs first, and despite the pain, there was a sense of relief in that. The next morning, I woke to my phone buzzing incessantly. Missed calls, text messages, and even emails poured in from my family. The group chat, which I'd often ignored, was now flooded with a flurry of messages. Mom, Jake, we need to talk. Don't do this to the family. Dad, I'm disappointed in you. Ethan's been trying his best to keep this family together, and you repay him like this. Ethan, what kind of brother are you? You don't deserve to call yourself part of this family. I scrolled through the barrage, my chest tightening with each accusatory word. There wasn't a single message asking how I was doing. No acknowledgement of the boundaries I had fought so hard to assert. It was the same pattern all over again. Guilt, blame, and manipulation. For a moment, I considered responding. Maybe I could explain one last time why their behavior was unacceptable. But as I typed out a reply, I stopped. What would be the point? I'd spent years trying to make them understand, and all I'd received in return was more hurt. Instead, I muted the group chat and set my phone aside. For the first time in years, I chose silence over engagement. By the end of the week, Mum showed up unannounced at my apartment. I opened the door to find her standing there, clutching a container of homemade lasagna like it was a peace offering. Can I come in? She asked softly. I hesitated, but stepped aside. She placed the lasagna on the counter and turned to face me, her eyes red-rimmed. Jake, what happened? Why are you doing this? We're a family. I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. Mum, I've been telling you for years how I feel, how you've treated me, but no one listens. Last night was the final straw. Ethan crossed a line, and instead of holding him accountable, you all enabled him. Her face crumpled. That's not fair. Ethan was just trying to help. Help? I snapped. By invading my privacy and setting up an account to take my money. That's not help, Mom. That's exploitation. Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. Not this time. I didn't know about the account, she said quietly. But you have to understand. Ethan's under a lot of pressure. His job isn't as stable as he makes it seem, and the boy's expenses are piling up. He's just trying to provide for his family, and that's my responsibility because... Why? I asked, my voice rising. Because I worked hard, made sacrifices, and built a life for myself. That doesn't give him the right to take what I've earned. She reached out, placing a hand on my arm. Jake, we don't want to lose you. Please, don't let this tear us apart. I stepped back, shaking my head. I didn't tear us apart, Mom. You all did every time you dismissed me, overlooked me, and treated me like I didn't matter. This isn't on me. Her tears spilled over, but I didn't waver. After a few moments of silence, she nodded, picking up her lasagna and heading for the door. If this is what you want, Jake, I can't stop you. But just remember, family is all we have. Family is supposed to be supportive, I said quietly, not draining. She left without another word, and as the door closed behind her, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. For the next few days, I replayed the confrontation in my mind. Despite the anger and frustration, a part of me felt an aching sadness. They were my family, and no matter how much they hurt me, I couldn't just erase years of connection. But I couldn't keep sacrificing my well-being to maintain a relationship that only drained me. I confided in Sarah, who had been my lifeline throughout this ordeal. We sat in her cozy living room, a bottle of wine between us. I feel like I've burned a bridge I can't rebuild, I admitted, swirling the wine in my glass. Jake, she said gently, you didn't burn that bridge. They did. You've been trying to fix it for years, and they've only ever met you halfway when it benefited them. It's okay to let go. Her words settled over me like a warm blanket, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of peace. With my family dynamic in shambles, I threw myself into work and personal growth. I started attending therapy sessions more regularly, diving deep into the patterns of guilt and self-doubt that had kept me tethered to my family's toxic behavior. I also began focusing on things that brought me joy, hobbies I'd abandoned, and connections I'd neglected. Sarah and I planned a hiking trip for the following month, and I even started taking cooking classes, something I'd always wanted to try. One evening, I received an email from Ethan. It was surprisingly short. Jake, I messed up. I know I crossed a line, and I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it. I stared at the screen, my emotions swirling. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever expected from him. I didn't reply. Not yet. I wasn't ready. But it was a start. Weeks turned into months, and while the pain of the family fallout lingered, I began to see it as a necessary step in my journey. My family's perception of me had always been warped, but I was no longer willing to let their expectations define me. I still heard from Mum occasionally, mostly vague updates or attempts to coax me back into the fold, but I held firm, maintaining the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living on my terms. And while the road ahead wasn't entirely clear, I knew one thing for sure: I was finally free. The weeks following my confrontation with my family felt like I had emerged from a fog. The weight of years of expectations, guilt, and frustration was gone, replaced by a quiet clarity I hadn't felt in ages. I had no illusions that my life would instantly transform into a perfect picture of happiness, but for the first time, I felt like I was steering my own ship. One of the first things I did was reevaluate how I spent my time. Without the constant drain of family drama, my weekends became my own again. I started exploring hobbies I'd set aside for years: painting, hiking, and even a bit of writing. Each activity felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. I also made a deliberate effort to surround myself with people who brought positivity into my life. Sarah, my ever-loyal best friend, was at the forefront. We planned outings, dinners, and even a small getaway to the mountains. I found myself reconnecting with old friends and making new ones through a local book club I joined. These were people who valued me for who I was, not what I could offer them. As I immersed myself in this new chapter, I realized how much energy I'd been pouring into relationships that didn't reciprocate. Now, that energy was fueling my growth, and the change was liberating. Work became a cornerstone of my newfound independence. With my family no longer monopolizing my thoughts, I threw myself into my job with renewed focus. I spearheaded a challenging project that not only showcased my skills, but also earned me the respect of my peers and a well-deserved promotion. The recognition was validating, but more than that, it was a reminder that I was capable of achieving success on my own terms. My career had always been a source of pride, but now it felt like a foundation for the life I was building, a life no one could undermine or take credit for. Therapy played a pivotal role in helping me process the fallout with my family. Dr. Bennett guided me through the complex emotions of guilt, anger, and grief that often bubbled to the surface. One session in particular stood out. "You've spent so much of your life trying to prove your worth to them," Dr. Bennett said. "But worth isn't something you earn. It's something you have inherently. The question isn't whether you're enough for them. It's whether they're enough for you." Her words struck a chord. For years, I had been chasing their approval, bending over backward to fit into a mold they'd created for me. But I was finally realizing that my value wasn't tied to their validation. My worth was intrinsic, and I didn't need to justify it to anyone. One evening, I received an unexpected call from Ethan. Hesitating for a moment, I finally answered, unsure of what to expect. "Hey," he said, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." It wasn't the grand gesture of reconciliation I'd fantasized about, but it was a step. Ethan admitted he had crossed a line and acknowledged that his actions had been driven by insecurity. "I was jealous," he confessed, "of how successful you've become. I thought if I could find something to bring you down, it would make me feel better about myself." Hearing those words felt like a small victory, but I knew I couldn't let them erase the years of hurt. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "But Ethan, I need time. This isn't something we can fix overnight." Our conversation ended amicably, but I made it clear that rebuilding trust would take more than an apology. It was a lesson I had learned the hard way. Boundaries weren't just a defense. They were a form of self-respect. Over time, my parents made sporadic attempts to reconnect. Mom would send texts asking about my life, and Dad occasionally left voicemails sharing updates about the family. I responded sparingly, careful not to fall back into old patterns. When I did agree to meet, it was always on my terms. A brief coffee in a neutral setting, with no obligation to revisit the past. These interactions were civil but distant, a stark contrast to the tangled dynamic we once shared. I no longer sought their approval, and that shift in power gave me a sense of control I hadn't realized I needed. As I settled into my new normal, joy became a regular part of my life. I started dating someone I met through the book club, a thoughtful, kind-hearted person named Alex. They understood my history without judgment and supported my journey toward healing. With Alex, I felt seen and valued in a way I never had before. We spent weekends exploring local trails, cooking elaborate meals, and dreaming about the future. For the first time, the idea of building my own family felt like a possibility, not a burden. One crisp autumn afternoon, I received a letter in the mail from my parents. Inside was a short, handwritten note from Mom. "Jake, we've been thinking a lot about what you said. We realize now how much we've hurt you over the years, and we're sorry. We don't expect you to forgive us right away, but we hope we can start over, even if it's just as friends. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress." I wasn't ready to fully reconcile, but knowing they were beginning to acknowledge their role in our strained relationship was enough for now. Looking back, I saw the journey for what it was: painful, necessary, and transformative. The experience had taught me invaluable lessons about self-respect, boundaries, and the importance of surrounding myself with people who uplifted me. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was mine, messy, beautiful, and entirely my own. And for the first time in years, that was enough.